And if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do.
What's up, everybody? So in this video, I'm going to be talking about Exodus chapter 21 and 7, because there are atheists that use this verse to say that the Bible is condoning somebody selling their daughter into slavery, specifically sexual slavery, which is what I'm going to be addressing in this video. And I've addressed it in past videos as well, but this video is going to be a lot shorter. So without further ado, let's get right into it now. Before we can determine whether or not verse 7 and 8 is talking about any form of slavery, there's something that I have to point out. When you read this chapter as a whole, you read it in some translations, it translates this as being slaves. For example, it says, if you buy a Hebrew slave, telling the Israelites how to deal with one another. Like I explained in this video, in that video, when reading the Bible, it's always context over translation. We know this can't be talking about slavery because literally in this same book is when God delivered the children of Israel from being slaves. And when you read Leviticus chapter 25 that addresses a similar issue, it literally says that you can't cause your brother to serve you as a slave. And another reason is because literally in this same chapter in verse 16, it says, and he that steals a man and sells him, or if it be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So you kidnap someone and you sell him, or even if you haven't yet done it, just by kidnapping them, you will be put to death. This includes kidnapping or forcing your own daughter to become a slave. It says the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and 7, that if a man be found stealing any of his brethren of the children of Israel and make merchandise of him or sells him, then that thief shall die, and you shall put evil away from among you. When you read the other verses prior to verse 7 and 8, you will see that this is not somebody who's being kidnapped to work. This is not somebody who is being sold against their will. This is somebody who sold themselves. And it specifically says that in Leviticus chapter 25, if your brother that is poor sell himself unto you. And if you've ever heard anyone quote Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 through 46, to say that the Bible is okay with slavery, I have a video for that too. And I'm not going to address that in this video because I'm specifically focusing on Exodus in this video. Now, with all of that being said, we can understand that this passage, this chapter, doesn't have anything to do with slavery. But let's look at verse 7. It says, and if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. Now, when you read verses prior to verse 7, it talks about how if somebody was poor, they could sell themselves to the service of another person. They would work for them as a hired servant, or what we would call an employee today, as it says in Leviticus chapter 25 and Deuteronomy chapter 15. This is not somebody who was forced to work, but somebody who willingly chose to do this. They would work for that person for 6 years, and then in the year of Jubilee, they would no longer work for that person anymore. They could choose to work for somebody else. But as long as they willingly chose to work for that first person, they would have to do this for a total of 6 years. It's the same way how today, when people have certain jobs, they make contracts with the people that they're working for, saying, I'm going to work for X amount of years. In certain fields, in certain industries, you see this happen. It's no different from what was happening back then as well. However, if you read some verses down, it talks about how if you abused this person, you exploited them or anything, then they no longer would be obligated to work for you despite whatever contract that you guys made. Now, to break down verse 7, there's a couple of things that we have to address. When you read Jeremiah chapter 34, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 15, and even this same chapter that all address the same thing, they all say that women that work, women that completed this contract, even they would no longer be obligated to work after those 6 years were completed. So now we have to ask ourselves, why is it that here, number one, the woman is not being let out? Why is she continuing to be held or bound to this contract? And why is her father involved? And I ask why the father is involved because other passages about her working is about her selling herself, not anyone else selling her. Now let's read Exodus chapter 21 verse 7. It says, and if anyone sells his daughter, sell his daughter as a domestic, she shall not depart as the maidservants depart. Just wanted to read this because it shows that the women serving were not being discriminated against. Because I've heard people that make the argument about Exodus chapter 21 being about slavery, saying that women were not allowed to leave after working, which is very not true. And notice how he or she's being referred to as a domestic. This is the definition. It says relating to the running of a home or to family relations. What does family have to do with anything here? Now, let's look at Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. It says, and if a man entice a maid, not betrothed, that is not betrothed, and maid in this context simply just means an unmarried woman, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. Now, the Bible says we should flee fornication. You shouldn't lay with somebody and then marry them later on. You're supposed to marry the person first. But it's saying that if this were to happen, hypothetically, this is what would have been done during that time. Next, let's look at the Hebrew word used for endow. He shall surely endow her to be his wife. It says to obtain or acquire by paying purchase price, to give a dowry, to obtain in exchange. As it says here, the father would be given the dowry. He would be given this bride price, and his daughter would be given into marriage in exchange. That was the context of the selling in Exodus chapter 21. It wasn't talking about a girl being sold against her will, as it said in that chapter in verse 16, that if you kidnap someone and you sell them against their will, you shall be put to death. But the idea of selling or being sold here in this context is talking about marriage. This was the culture at that time, and usually dowries were paid to make sure that whoever wanted to marry that man's daughter could be able to financially support her. And it's not talking about child marriage either, as others try to make that claim, because Genesis chapter 2 verse 24 says that marriage is between a man and a woman, not between man and child. And if you study the culture in Israel, a woman cannot get married until she was 20, or man or a woman cannot get married until they were 20, contrary to claims that people try to make about the Bible that, oh, people were getting married at 13 and 16. Not in the Bible. In fact, you weren't even considered an adult until you reached the age of 20, not even 18, as it is in the United States, where you're literally still a teenager. The reason why it said in Exodus chapter 21, she will not go out as the other female servants do, is simply because in this case, she's getting married. That's why marriage is involved in this case. That's why family was mentioned in the definition that I read earlier. And just two more pieces of proof that prove that this is not talking about sexual slavery is Leviticus chapter 19 verse 29 that says, do not prostitute your daughter to cause her to be a whore, lest the land fall to whoredom and the land become full of wickedness. Another piece of proof, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 17, there shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. So you couldn't even do that to your son. That's just plain wickedness. Exodus 21:16, Deuteronomy chapter 24 and 7. You can't sell your children into slavery. 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10, that explicitly states that slavery is contrary to sound doctrine. So Exodus chapter 21 verse 7 is not about slavery of any kind, especially sexual slavery.